Associate Professor in the Department of Cinematic Arts at the University of Iowa, and she is the author of Counter-Archive, Film, The Everyday, and Albert Camus' Archives de la Planète, which was published by Columbia University Press in 2010. And her talk today is entitled Ambient Chaos, the Archival Imaginary in Post-War French Film Culture. Welcome.
Thank you so much to Christina and to Emma for organising this symposium. It's been a pleasure to be here, and it's an absolutely fascinating series of talks that I've been learning much from. So I'm going to start without further ado. One of the more concrete ways in which film's ambivalent connection to reality made itself manifest in its first decades was in differing perceptions of film's archival proclivities, and in particular, its potential as an archival source for history. If, for its supporters, film promised a superior record of total recall, to its detractors it delivered a machine-rendered, indiscriminate, soulless reel, drained of naturalistic sound and colour. As for film's potential as an archival source, it's irrefutable that its storage, retrieval, and semantic capacities were unmanageable and incomprehensible, especially compared to photography. And actually, Sven made this point a little bit earlier as well. Now, this mixture of optimism and pessimism regarding film's ability to serve history continued into the mid-20th century. For French film critic André Bazin, the newsreel's near-instantaneous blanket coverage of events during the Second World War paradoxically left reality uncovered, exposing a history of the present that was as unconfrontable as an open wound. And this is what he's talking about in our first quote here. Echoing Bazin's concerns, Arthur Elton, then president of the British Scientific Film Association, argued that non-fiction film before 1930 bequeathed to later generations an unusable mass of incidental visual chit-chat, lacking the epic and ordered sense of serious historical documents. Now, although Bazin judged newsreels of the present and Elton those of the recent past, and both ultimately advocated for film as a new form of history, their expressions of caution were rooted in the ongoing uncertainty regarding the medium's problematic archival tendencies. As I've already argued in Counter-Archive, film's troublesome archival status in the first decades of cinema stemmed from its association not only with the waywardly indecent eye of the camera, but with forms of memory that were incomplete, intermittent, and involuntary, in spite of the medium's appeal to a mechanistically comprehensive record of the past. This talk begins with the premise that the mid-20th century marks a significant transitional point in the history of film's articulation to an archival imaginary, here meant to connote the material and conceptual imprint of the archive upon filmmaking. I argue that an expanded consciousness of film's relation to the archive following the Second World War allowed critics and filmmakers to negotiate more confidently new models of cinematic memory. A vital contribution to this intensified awareness occurs in André Bazin's curiously polarised writings on compilation or archival films, known in France as film de montage. The two extremes of Bazin's thinking on the issue of archival films appear in two articles he wrote in 1946-47. The first, a critical review of Frank Capra's government-sponsored Why We Fight series, subtitled History, Documentation and the Newsreel. The second, a celebratory review, still untranslated, of Nicole Vedrese's Chronicle of the Belle Époque, Paris 1900, that he titled In hommage to Proust à la recherche du temps perdu. In the first of these reviews, Bazin focused upon the war's incitement of archival frenzy due to the fatal coupling of total war and total history, the latter referring to the all-encompassing documentation and subsequent drive for preservation that resulted from the camera's unprecedented, quote-unquote, omnipresence in space and time, end quote. The cinematic materialisation of this symbiosis of violence and history occurs for Bazin in the newsreel's claims, quote, to observe history in the making, end quote, from every possible vantage point. Needs Elton refers to, which counter the ephemeral, presentist ones of commercial interests, are implicitly archival, understood in this instance to mean beyond time and eventually intended for the production of history. Although Elton slightly exaggerates the unprecedented nature of this attentiveness to the historical value of film, as early examples do exist, for example, the Caen Archive and French and British Army archives from World War I, it is fair to say that this period witnessed a deepened recognition of the historical value of what Marcel Martin called in 1963, in opposition to the short memory of human beings, the long memory of film. It is this widespread appreciation of film's unlimited memory and unblinking eye on the world that is no doubt at play in the above reference to the cameraman's orders to get coverage, an imperative also influenced by the era's overriding threat of nuclear apocalypse. Bazin's attempt in his Why We Fight review to come to terms with this magnification of archival awareness led him to a much more pessimistic appraisal of the docu-utopia of complete coverage offered by film's omnipresence in space and time. No doubt also thinking of television's expansion, while uncannily foreshadowing our own screen-saturated era of media fatigue, Bazin refers, and here we have the quote here, to the hundreds of thousands of screens making us watch history every day, and compares the newsreel's daily update of history in the making to a type of ongoing exfoliation of the face of history. Quote, as soon as it forms, history's skin peels off again. La peau de l'histoire tombe en pellicule. Bazin situated Capra's Why We Fight series as a direct offspring of the war's expansion of the international archival stock of historical footage. Comprised nearly entirely of re-edited newsreels, Why We Fight demonstrates for Bazin how the reassemblage of footage, quote unquote, shot for other purposes can achieve the flexibility and precision of language, end quote. Ultimately, however, he accuses the Hollywood director's formal strategy in the series, dominated by the re-editing of newsreels with a new soundtrack, of, quote-unquote, intellectual deception, as it subordinates, quote, the events pictured on screen to the cement of the words and the soundtrack, end quote. In other words, the overall visual and sound montage failed to respect, here I quote, intrinsic and distinct values, end quote, of images and words, facts and commentary. For Bazin, the infamously anti-montage theorist of mostly fiction film, here again was proof of editing's violent diminishment of meaning and affect within the durational continuity of the single, in this instance, non-fiction shot. He ends the review distinguishing between written and filmed history's access to the historical fact, the former dependent upon the mind and human language to reconstruct and argue about the past event, the latter benefiting from a shorthand method whereby, quote, we can refer to the facts in flesh and blood, end quote. And yet the more concrete facts through which film can write history are just as subject to manipulation, which leads Bazin to ask, and here I quote, could they bear witness to something else other than themselves, to something else other than the narrative of which they form a part? I think that far from moving the historical sciences toward more objectivity, the cinema paradoxically gives them the additional power of illusion, that is, the ability to falsify through editing, by its very realism, end quote. Not yet willing to explore the positive, revelatory side of this illusionism, Bazin describes it here as, quote-unquote, dangerous, comparing edited film's capacity for deception to, quote, the rape of the masses, end quote. Limited by its obvious propagandistic function, Capra's Why We Fight series thus ultimately represented for Bazin a missed opportunity to build productively upon an alternative potential that lay within the practice of reusing archival footage. Instead, it offered a glimpse of, quote, tomorrow's historian of the masses, end quote, figured as a shady ventriloquist of the dead, serving a debased variety of history, currently, quote, being prepared in all the film archives of the world, end quote. Now, Bazin's quasi-Gothic invocation of the archive conforms to a deep anti-archival tradition within French intellectual history, which from Charles Baudelaire and Henri Bergson onto Michel Foucault, Michel de Certeau, Jacques Derrida, and Pierre Nora, has derided the archive as the servant, graveyard, or factory of history. In one of the most influential and more recent critiques of the archive's status as guardian of true memory, the annales historian Pierre Nora took up the language of shedding skin and its association with deception as a metaphor for the constant updating required of archival records, those debased stand-ins for the living memory of the past. And here I quote, "Memory has begun to keep records. Delegating the responsibility for remembering to the archive, it deposits its signs as the snake deposits its shed skin," end quote. Not surprisingly, Nora highlights film as one of these impoverished substitutes for memory, constantly subject to the external, the impermanent, and the deceitful, as implied by the image of cast-off skin. Yet just as the French anti-archival tendency also contains within it significant, if mostly overlooked, insights into the positive dimensions of the archive, so too does Bazin's surface rejection of the archive leave room from an embrace of film's counter-archival historical potential. Just 1 year after his review of Why We Fight, Bazin begins to explore more fully the alternative modes of history lying dormant within the film vaults. In stark contrast to his negative view of archival film's ability to produce history as propaganda, he has nothing but praise for another archival-based re-edited film, Paris 1900, in which he discovers a Proustian temporality marked by the eruptions of the accidental and a new example of what he calls pure cinema, liberated from the aesthetic norms of contemporary film practice. So what exactly did Vedrez do with archival footage in Paris 1900 that caused Bazin to compare the film's overhauling, as he calls it, of cinematic norms to Proust's overhauling of novelistic norms, while also leading him to state that from now on, all fiction film would be superfluous, declaring that, quote, "I would never dare touch a camera after having seen Paris 1900," end quote. Paris 1900's striking appeal can be attributed to three interrelated features: its hyper-archival awareness, cancel? I'll let you do that. Three interrelated features: its hyper-archival awareness, its dependence upon a fragmented, heterogeneous assortment of authorless, ready-made facts or film fragments, and its arousal of what Bazin and Krakow describe or allude to, Krakow also writes about the film, as alienated memories that ultimately relate to its memory of the future temporal structure and more generally cinema's relationship to death. Now I'm just going to touch on some of these aspects in what remains of this talk. Prior to her work on Paris 1900, Nicole Vedrez had become intimately familiar with one of the founding archives of French cinema, Henri Langlois' Cinémathèque Française, when in 1945 she edited an unconventional book titled Images du cinéma français, comprised nearly entirely of frame enlargements sourced from fiction, non-fiction, and unknown films from the collection. The history that unfolds in this book, and we're seeing a double spread from it here, is essayistic, subjective, and evocative, rather than informational, objective, and comprehensive. And I think I've got another. As such, it bears the stamp of Langlois' idiosyncratic approach to film history, showcased, for example, in the inaugural exhibition of his cinema museum in December 1944, which was also titled Images du cinéma français. Comprised of what Laurent Manoni has called a strange accumulation of objects and archives, the 1944 landmark exhibition contained the seeds of all Langlois' future shows, quote unquote. It offers no chronological path, there is no theoretical discourse, but rather absolute disorder, in spite of some educational panels, end quote. A state of creative chaos also characterised Langlois' film collecting practice, as mythologised in Denis Bellon's photograph from around 1946 of what we might call Langlois' bath archive. Now, although staged, Bellon's photograph mixes fact with fiction. The option of storing films in a bathtub was not so ludicrous during the Second World War, given the real threat of a Nazi takeover of the French film heritage. On the other hand, the image poses an impossible contradiction in its intermingling of film preservation and destruction, the gas-water heater residing over the nitrate reels like an incendiary guardian, while the water it contains promises a deliverance from a possible nitrate fire. The iconic image thus stands as a sort of surreal hallucinatory fact, and here I'm using hallucinatory fact coming out of Bazin's essay on the ontology of photography. So it stands as a sort of surreal hallucinatory fact regarding the state of film archiving in the immediate post-war years. Vedrez reprised the spirit of the photograph in her own drawing of the archival surreal, published to illustrate an article she wrote in March 1948 that details the unconventional research within, quote, caves, rabbit sheds and cinematheque bunkers, end quote, that went into the making of Paris 1900. The sketch, ironically titled The Studios of Paris 1900, depicts her assistant, the then unknown Alain René, wielding a broom and Vedrez handling an unrolled film reel together in an underground shelter containing caged rabbits, silent cinema movie posters, and haphazardly arranged cans of film, all presided over by a candle-carrying ghost named Henri Langlois, who the author tells us in the article gave his blessing to their pilgrimage through the Cinémathèque Française. Described by Vedrez as anything but a quote-unquote classificatory rationalist, Langlois advised her and René to be guided in their archival searches by quote-unquote instinct rather than catalogue, end quote. This anti-classificatory, anti-positivist tendency clearly underpinned the counter-archival method open to the involuntary, accidental and fortuitous that we see in the film, and that undermines the opening credits' historicist deference to authentic documents. Now, beyond the indirect and direct stamp of Langlois upon the film's sources and methodologies, and he's credited before this intertitle here, the second hint we get early on in Paris 1900, that its nostalgic facade is nothing but a decoy, occurs in the increasingly wry and mocking tone of the narrator. For example, to the image of a group of self-satisfied members of the Académie Française, he intones, who in 50 years' time will even know them? And to footage of the 1910 floods, whose effects he claims were worse than a war, he sarcastically states, but wars are fortunately a thing of the past. The ridiculing aspect of his narration, so different from the straightforward impartiality of a voice of God commentator, increases in the second half of the film and turns bitterly pessimistic by the end. And here I'm showing one of the images from the end of the film where we have soldiers at the Gare de l'Est going off to the war in August 1914. And the narration to this is they go towards the future with faces that do not know how to face what comes before them. Most importantly, it has the overall effect, the narration, of dislodging the commentary from the image, thereby encouraging a spectatorial space of critical, sceptical distance that Bazin sorely missed in the didactically closed relationship between sound and image in the Why We Fight series. Nearly a decade before Alain René dismantled documentary codes with Night and Fog's sceptical and ironic voiceover commentary, Vedrez cracks the cemented relation between commentary and image tracks. The auditory cracks in the film's surface are magnified at the level of the image track, which in a revealing discussion of the film, Vedrez likened to a puzzle. In addition to film footage of varying quality and texture, the film's material heterogeneity extends to its intermedia mosaic of photographs, postcards, paintings, and newspaper clippings. The uneven, collage-like composition continues in the mixing of still and moving archival material, as well as the combining of high and low cultural references, and most importantly, non-fiction and fiction footage. With the indexical guarantee of the footage no longer primary, due to this mixing of fiction and non-fiction, and the narrator no longer trustworthy, Vedrez moves us further and further away from the idea of cinematic history based upon an essentialist definition of documentary film's realism. Another aspect of the film's fragmented nature is its unique cinematic, citationless method of combining different sources. As with nearly all compilation films, none of the fragments from supposedly 700 different films are referenced. They appear without quotation marks, as it were, unmoored from their original sources, floating free in an authorless vacuum of visual facts. As such, they fly in the face of historical scholarship's evidentiary and author-based methods for citing different sources. Their contextless appearance in the film also mirrors the catalogue-free state of their archival storage. Before and during the war, it was standard for non-fiction films to be stored without any information as to their date, title, subject, or cameraman, as Vedrez herself testified to in her description of the state of the archive she consulted as ambient chaos. Indeed, fiction and non-fiction footage was often collected and preserved in archives on the same reel. Paris 1900's citationless assemblage of film fragments also relates to its authorless, cameraless mode. That is, those features that led Bazin to associate it with the avant-garde implications of pure cinema. In applying this term to Paris 1900, Bazin conjures the outlines of a new type of history, whose exhibition mode Langlois had been exploring since the mid-1940s, one untroubled by the authorless, cameraless mode's confirmation of film's essentially ambiguous delivery of the real, devoid of intentionality and curiously once removed from its ontological photographic base. The film's cut-and-paste form connects to its third feature, its arousal, resulting from the orphaned nature of its film fragments of alienated, unclaimed memories of the past. Paris 1900 awakens for Bazin what he insightfully described in his review as recollections that, quote-unquote, do not belong to us, drawn from the disembodied anonymity of the world archive of film and, quote-unquote, a memory exterior to our consciousness. A type of memory that René would go on to explore in his film Toute la mémoire du monde from 1956, his own documentary focused on another institution of archive fatigue, the Bibliothèque Nationale. In short, these brief resuscitations from the past deliver for Bazin, as they did for Krakow, a haunting post-human embodiment of not presence but absence, not life but death, or perhaps more accurately, life in the face of death. The crucial step within the philosophical and aesthetic dimension of Bazin's argument regarding Paris 1900 occurs when he associates the unique quality of Vedrez's montage of old fragments with a tear, un déchirement, in the film's surface or skin. Not coincidentally, Bazin's use of the word tear reveals him to still be working with the language of violent exposure that underpinned his use the year before of the skin metaphor. This time, however, the peeling has narrowed into a rip, which, though still destructive, now acquires the paradoxical quality of, quote-unquote, a monstrously beautiful, end quote, allure, whose non-fiction origins Bazin explored further the same year under the guise of the accidental beauty of scientific films. It is this tear, indicative of the film's puzzle-like fragmented form, not to mention the threadbare, worn-out state of the footage, that unstitches the image's ties to positivist, objective, archival history, which he referred to explicitly in the review of How We Fight as film's relation to straight historical facts, end quote. This slit in film's skin-like surface, Bazin ultimately argues, creates an opening between, quote, chance and reality, end quote, through which a different type of what I call counter-archival history might emerge. One that, like Langlois' exhibition practice that influenced Vedrez, was responsive to an appreciation of the cinematic image as simultaneously real and fantastic, factual and hallucinatory, objective and subjective, present and past, always in flux. Now, Vedrez herself acknowledged that she never intended for the film to teach, quote, a history, nor even the history of the Belle Epoque, end quote. Rather than delivering a purely subjective, or objective, the chronology of past events, the film animates an ebb and flow of time, moving in different directions. Its temporal restlessness a product of the unhinged nature of the film's fragments of archived time. Paris 1900's tears thus open onto the essential to quote Bazin, cinematographic tragedy. That is, the paradoxically incomplete quality of film's archival or mechanistic capacity to store the past, I should say. As Bazin puts it, quote, the cinema is a machine for regaining time, all the better to lose it, end quote. Destroying what it aims to preserve, it thus embodies, somewhat like Langlois' Bath archive and Bazin's figure of shedding skin, a nightmare and dream of archival preservation. The film's most shocking collision between cinema's drives to preserve and destroy appears in the 1912 footage of a birdman who jumps to his death from the Eiffel Tower. Here you can see the passage of this jump to his death. Although Bazin only mentioned the scene in passing in the first 1947 review, it clearly disturbed him, as he remembered and commented upon it in the 1958 abridged and revised version of his Paris 1900 review that he republished in the all-important first volume of Qu'est-ce que le cinéma? In that revised essay, straight after his definition of the cinematographic tragedy of time, now slightly rewritten to end with the words time twice lost, Bazin, ironically experiencing his own doubled memory of the film, also felt compelled to add what he had previously edited, forgotten, or not fully processed about the film. And here I quote, there is perhaps something else which is born from this impersonal look with which from now on man gazes at history. So it is in that extraordinary Birdman sequence in which it seems obvious that the poor fool takes fright and finally recognises the absurdity of his bet. But there, fixing him for eternity, is the camera, whose soulless eye he finally doesn't dare deceive. Had there only been human witnesses, a wise cowardice would no doubt have come over him, end quote. Twice removed from his original experience of Paris 1900, Bazin confronts the full impact of the footage and recognises the scene's applicability to his 1947 meditation upon the film's alienated style of memory. He now directly positions the Birdman sequence as the product of a mortifyingly impersonal and soulless witness, the camera, whose gaze embodies the quote-unquote under the spotlights media preparedness of modern history, alluded to in his Why We Fight review. Thus, in the second 1958 version of the Paris 1900 review, the camera, whose absence was celebrated in the 1947 review, returns, yet not as the guarantor of humanist history, but as a hollow, ghostly recorder of life, the progenitor of that disinterested mode of history being prepared in all the film archives of the world. As subsequent filmmakers, philosophers, and film and art historians have suggested, and here I'm alluding to Jean-Luc Godard, Guy Deleuze, Antoine de Bec, Georges Didier Huberman, it was the revelation of the cinematographic records of the concentration camps, once liberated from the archives and revealing as much for what they did not show as for what they showed, that arguably marked the turning point, not just of the 20th century, but also of the history of cinema, as a medium that had lost its representational innocence connected to its supposedly inviolable mission to witness the real. Film archives, Paris 1900 teaches us, are the structuring absence, not only in Bazin's cinematographic tragedy of time twice lost, but also in the often noted post-World War II crisis in representation, resulting from the cinema's paradoxical ability to draw attention to the passage from life to death of one human in the face of its simultaneous inability to represent or sufficiently bear witness to the annihilation of millions in both world wars. If in response to this dilemma, an anti-archival direction would emerge by the 1980s, which militated on behalf of an ethical imperative to not use archival footage in documentaries dealing with the Holocaust, a position associated with the work of Claude Lanzmann and Marcel Auffoulz, Paris 1900 belongs to an earlier mid-century counter-archival investment in a strategic politics and poetics of the archive. One tradition is based in an intransigent anti-archival ethics, the other in a more flexible counter-archival reinvention of ethics in the archive, in which the soulless eye of the archival camera transforms into the 20th century's most impassioned historian. Thank you. Controversy and debates around film's historical proclivities in the early 20th century. And part of what I do in that conceptual theoretical part of the book is sort of uncover the ways in which, looking through a whole range of discourses, particularly in the trade press, but particularly also using the writings of Henri Bergson, because Bergson was the intellectual inspiration for Kahn's archive. I sort of come together to thinking about, or I bring together all of the sort of ways in which film, and here is, you know, it's very important to note how it was distinguished from photography, challenged textual-based notions of the historical record. So in that book, counter-archival is this term for about 5 or 6 ways in which film, particularly focusing upon issues of contingency, issues of chaotic disorder, of informational overload, okay, something that's quite different with a photograph, challenged positivist conceptions of the historical document. But then I also go into other aspects of why the films, why film as a medium was seen to be disturbing to conventional you know, understandings of what a historical document could do. And a lot of this has to do with the indecent eye of the camera as well. You know, there's a lot of writing about how cameramen were all of a sudden, you know, capturing things that had never been captured before. So that's the origins to how I'm using counter-archive. But in this paper, I think that part of what I'm finding so interesting in the mid-20th century and that I'm seeing being reflected upon in these, just a couple of essays by Bazin, and really put into practice by this fascinating filmmaker who hasn't been written about a lot, Nicole Vedrez, is the way in which they are materialising what I've earlier been thinking about in the early cinema period through a new type of reassemblage of archival footage. So I think there's quite a self-consciousness and a reflection upon how this isn't just doing normal, objective, positivist history, that the cinema and these new types of history making, such as these archival films, are you know, producing and allowing a more effective, and this is a film that you know, Bazin will write about, and he will say, I've never been left with such tears of pleasure after seeing a film. So you know, there's aspects of affect that are being aroused in these films. There's also very much this interest, I only touch on it here, in a type of, and this is of course where, you know, noting that Alain René is the apprentice to Nicole Vedrez is really important. There are really fascinating interruptions to linear chronology within this film as well. So although on the surface, and it's a film that, you know, is very nostalgic on the surface, and you can see that in the posters. You know, on the surface, this is a film that's about the Belle Epoque, and she even describes it as a chronicle of the Belle Epoque from 1900 to 1914. But there are very circuitous, complicated forebodings of the future wrapped into the past that's going on in this type of history that she's doing. So just to give a quick example, all of the sort of monuments to progress that we see in the first half of the film, like the Ferris wheel of the 1900 Expo, etc. All of these images of women, you know, taking up, you know, gender transgressive roles, etc. All of these monuments to progress sort of fall into this temporal slide that ends in World War I. So it's a film that's really about the pre-history of World War I, told through the perspective of the immediate aftermath of World War II. So they're just some of the ways in which I'm thinking about, you know, the counter-archival flexibility of film that's really being explored in much more self-conscious ways in this period than was happening in the early 20th century. Yeah.